the dead chill of the winter of 1887, a single photograph emerged from the frozen wilderness, a ghostly image that would stalk the Charleston courthouse for generations. It depicted 17 children, their ages spanning from 3 to 16, barefoot and shivering in the snow before a rotting cabin deep in the hollows of West Virginia. Their thin limbs and hollowed faces told of starvation, but it wasn't their frailty that made the image unbearable to look at. It was the iron shackles glinting at their ankles, the cruel proof of captivity. Official census records spoke of only 4 children living in the Greylock household of Bone Creek Hollow. The remaining 13 vanished into silence. No birth certificates, no school records, no trace of life beyond that haunting photograph. They had been wiped clean from the world, their existence erased by every adult who called those mountains home. Before we descend further into the darkness that shrouded the Greylock family and the monstrous crimes buried deep in the Appalachian wild, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tap that notification bell. Here, we resurrect the blackest corners of American history, the true horrors that time tried to forget. And tell us, from which state do you listen tonight? Let's see how far the echoes of these forgotten nightmares reach. That single photograph was only the spark, the first clue in what would unravel into one of the most chilling cases of child enslavement in American history. Beneath layers of silence, complicity, and mountain superstition, Bone Creek Hollow had festered like an open wound, a scar carved deep into the West Virginia highlands. In 1887, this valley stood apart from the world, cut off by mountain passes that turned lethal once winter came, walls of ice sealing its secrets from prying eyes. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 27 miles away, through twisting deer paths that could swallow the uninitiated whole. To reach it required more than endurance. It required the Hollow's trust, a thing few outsiders ever earned. Here, life followed a different rhythm, one set not by law or scripture, but by bloodlines and silence. Families had ruled their corners of the wilderness for generations, their alliances bound by the unspoken creed. What happened in the Hollow stayed in the Hollow. And no family embodied that creed more completely than the Greylocks. They had seized the valley's fertile lowlands back in 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock led his wife and 6 children through the Cumberland Gap during the Great Migration westward. But Jeremiah was no pioneer chasing gold or glory. He sought something darker, freedom from the gaze of the world. Isolation, to Jeremiah, was not hardship. It was power. The Hollow offered all he desired, pure water from Bone Creek, fertile fields rich with black loam, endless game in the dense forests, and most of all, absolute freedom from the eyes of the government, the church, or the law. It was a kingdom beyond accountability. By 1887, 3 generations later, the Greylocks had built more than a homestead. They had built an empire of control, a world unto itself. Under Ezekiel Greylock, Jeremiah's grandson, Bone Creek Hollow transformed into a place where one man's word became gospel. Ezekiel ruled over a network of kin, laborers, and what old county ledgers chillingly labeled as wards. Children with no past, no guardians, and no one to ask questions if they disappeared. Within the frozen heart of those mountains, Ezekiel's Hollow became a sealed dominion, a place where his justice was swift, his cruelty absolute, and no cry for mercy ever reached the world beyond the ridge. His methods of enforcing obedience were as ingenious as they were horrifying. Ezekiel Greylock was a man sculpted by the mountains themselves, tall and sinewy like a hickory sapling clinging to life on a frozen ridge, his eyes glacial and unblinking, the color of winter's heart. Many dismissed him as a backwoods simpleton, deceived by his tattered clothes and drawling speech. But beneath that carefully woven illusion of rustic ignorance lay a mind of cold calculation, a mind that had spent decades refining a system of power and punishment so precise it could have rivaled the most sadistic plantation overseers of the Old South. His wife, Martha Greylock, once Martha Kellerman of a neighboring hollow, was the perfect mirror to his cruelty. 3 decades of isolation had stripped her softness away, leaving behind something carved in stone and silence, as pitiless as the peaks that hemmed their world. Together, they ruled Bone Creek Hollow not as a family, but as sovereigns of fear. Their children, at least the 4 whom the records dared acknowledge, bore the imprint of that dominion. Samuel, the eldest at 19, had inherited his father's glacial intellect and the same twisted knack for invention in cruelty. Rebecca, 17, was quieter but no less dangerous. Her malice took subtler forms, a whisper, a gesture, a small deliberate act that cut deeper than any blade. The twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, both 14, had already learned the laws of survival in the Greylock house. Obedience without hesitation, silence without question, endurance without end. They were children in name only, disciples molded by terror, trained to never speak of what their eyes had seen in the shadowed corners of Bone Creek Hollow. Yet these 4 were merely the visible surface of a far darker structure. Beneath the household's facade lay the true engine of Greylock power, a hidden PIE. Population of children whose names were never written, whose faces were never remembered, and whose lives vanished into the fog of mountain myth. They were the unseen laborers, the voiceless workforce of a kingdom built on secrecy and fear. In an age when child mortality was common, when records were scarce and the wilderness swallowed the forgotten, Ezekiel had discovered the perfect loophole in civilization. He could purchase silence as easily as he purchased livestock. He could trade in lives with no ledger, no witness, and no consequence. The method was devilishly simple. During the brutal winters when hunger gnawed through entire families, desperate parents from neighboring hollows would come knocking at Ezekiel's door. They came to bind out their children, a familiar custom of the Appalachian poor, where struggling families entrusted sons and daughters to wealthier households in exchange for shelter, food, and the false promise of education. But once those children crossed into Bone Creek Hollow, they were gone forever. Their families were told comforting lies, that the children had moved on to distant towns, found work, or been sent to school. The truth was far bleaker. Inside the hollow, law and mercy held no meaning. The bound children became slaves in all but name, their lives reduced to toil, hunger, and silence. Others came through darker, quieter channels, orphans from failed farms, infants abandoned on church steps, children left behind after mining collapses or fevers that tore through mountain settlements. Each was quietly absorbed into the Greylock machine through a network of corruption. Crooked county clerks who forged names, traveling preachers who turned a blind eye, and neighbors willing to trade a child's life for a handful of silver and secrecy. By the winter of 1887, this infernal system had endured for more than 20 years. Officially, 6 people resided in the Greylock home. In truth, 21 souls lived within its decaying walls, 70 of them trapped in a shadow existence of endless labor, meager food, and punishments so cruel they defied belief. The photograph that would one day tear open the veil of their hidden world, the one that set the Charleston courthouse ablaze with horror, was never meant to be taken. It came to exist by accident, a frozen moment in December 1887, capturing not just the faces of those lost children, but the nightmare they were never meant to escape. The man who would accidentally expose one of Appalachia's darkest secrets was a traveling photographer named Henry Peton. He wandered through the mountain settlements that winter, hauling his bulky camera and fragile glass plates from one frozen hollow to the next, offering families a portrait, a moment of dignity, for the modest sum of 50 cents. For most of these isolated communities, where generations lived and died without ever being captured on film, such an offer was a rare gift, a way to carve their existence into history before time erased their names. Peton first heard whispers of the Greylock family during his brief stay in the trading town of Cedar Ridge. The locals spoke of Ezekiel Greylock with a wary respect, a man known to pay every debt in hard cash and produce far more than any farm in those mountains should have been capable of yielding. His jars of preserved fruit and sacks of cured meat appeared in local markets all year long, an impossible feat in such harsh terrain. Merchants spoke of him like a legend, a figure who prospered where others barely survived. Intrigued and sensing both profit and prestige in photographing such a family, Henry Peton packed his gear and set out on the grueling 27-mile trek to Bone Creek Hollow on December 15, 1887. What awaited him there shattered every expectation he held of backwoods mountain life. The Greylock homestead wasn't a crude log cabin tucked beneath the trees. It was a small empire hidden in the wilderness. Before him rose a cluster of meticulously built structures encircling a frozen courtyard. The main house, crafted from hand-hewn chestnut logs, stood 2 stories high with multiple rooms, gleaming glass windows, and a tall stone chimney whispering smoke into the pale sky. Around it sprawled a network of buildings, a vast barn, a line of workshops, and several outbuildings that looked far too organized, too permanent. Most unsettling of all were the long, narrow structures at the edge of the property. Dormitory-like halls, their barred windows giving the unsettling impression of an institution rather than a family dwelling. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Ezekiel Greylock greeted him with practiced warmth, his handshake firm, his words smooth. He presented his 4 official children, Samuel, Rebecca, and the twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, all impeccably dressed and rigidly polite, the picture of mountain discipline. But as Peton assembled his cumbersome camera in the central courtyard, he began to sense movement at the edges of his vision, small, darting shadows. Children, thin, pale figures lingering behind buildings, watching from behind piles of wood and fence posts. Their clothes were ragged, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, and every time Peton turned toward them, they slipped away like frightened ghosts. Curious, he mentioned them casually to Ezekiel. The patriarch's response was easy and unflinching. Those children, he said, were hired hands, orphans, poor cousins, charity cases taken in by the family out of Christian duty. We give them food and work, Ezekiel explained, his voice steady, his smile unbroken. In a place as remote as Bone Creek, such arrangements were common enough. Peton nodded, pretending to accept the answer, but the unease lingered. Something about the way those children movie. The stiffness, the silence, spoke not of discipline, but of fear. And then came the moment that tore away the illusion. As Peton prepared to photograph the family, a sudden commotion erupted from one of the distant outbuildings. Shouts, the sharp clatter of chains, the desperate patter of running feet across frozen ground. In an instant, several of the shadow children burst into the courtyard. What Peton saw next would sear itself into his memory for the rest of his life. These were no charity wards. They were living skeletons, their faces hollow, their eyes vacant from years of starvation and terror. Their clothing, torn and colorless, clung to them like burial cloth, and around their ankles, glinting coldly in the winter sun, were iron shackles, each joined by short, rusted chains that allowed them to shuffle but never flee. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Martha Greylock's voice cut through the frozen air, a shriek of such practiced fury that even the photographer flinched. She descended upon the children like a storm, her words laced with venom and authority born of decades of cruelty. It was in that instant that Henry Peton understood. The photograph he was about to take would not be a portrait of a family, but the accidental documentation of a nightmare buried deep within the Appalachian wilderness. Samuel and Rebecca sprang into motion like trained hounds, their movements swift, precise, and merciless. The 2 eldest Greylock children wielded their leather straps with the ease of habit, not in anger, but in mechanical obedience to a violence long rehearsed. Their strikes cracked through the frozen air, the sound merging with the terrified cries of the escapees. In that instant, the thin veneer of civility that Ezekiel Greylock had worn so carefully before his guest shattered completely. Gone was the courteous host, the respectable patriarch. What remained was something reptilian, cold, deliberate, inhumanly calm. His voice cut through the chaos like the crack of a whip, as he barked commands to restrain the workers, to restore discipline, to remind everyone that Bone Creek Hollow belonged to him and him alone. Henry Peton stood frozen at first, caught between disbelief and horror. But instinct, that strange survival of the professional mind, took hold. His camera was already mounted, the exposure plate already set for the family portrait. Without thinking, he lifted the cloth, steadied his trembling hands, and pressed the shutter. The lens opened for a single second, just long enough to trap the unfiltered truth in silver and glass. The resulting image would become one of the most haunting artifacts in Appalachian history. 17 children, barefoot in the snow, shackled at the ankles, staring into the camera with expressions of pure despair. No painting, no sermon, no testimony could have conveyed the silent agony frozen within that frame. Their hollow eyes seemed to plead not for rescue, but for remembrance. The aftermath came swiftly. Ezekiel's keen intelligence recognized the danger before the shutter had even finished its echo. His composure broke into fury as he demanded the glass plate on the spot, his voice rising with the authority of a man unaccustomed to being denied. But Piton, realizing with sick certainty what he had captured, summoned every ounce of calm he could muster. He feigned a professional failure, claimed that the exposure had been spoiled by the sudden movement, that he would need to prepare another. Ezekiel hesitated, then relented. The deception had bought Piton minutes, precious, irreplaceable minutes. Working with the speed of desperation, he concealed the exposed plate and slid a second one into the camera. This time, he took the portrait that Ezekiel demanded, the one the Greylocks wanted the world to see. 4 well-dressed children standing before their proud parents, posed in rigid respectability beneath a winter sky. When the shutter closed a second time, Ezekiel's confidence seemed to return. The mask slipped back into place. Satisfied that his secret remained intact, he even managed to smile as he thanked the photographer and paid him in cash. That evening, as the last light bled from the mountains, Henry Peton departed Bone Creek Hollow with 2 plates carefully wrapped and hidden in his pack. One held the image of the respectable Greylock family, the portrait of deception. The other, sealed in darkness, contained the unbearable truth. 3 days later, in a dim hotel room in Cedar Ridge, Piton developed both plates. His hands shook so violently that the chemicals nearly spilled. When the shadowed image of those 17 children began to appear on the paper, he stumbled back in horror. Their eyes, lifeless yet accusing, seemed to pierce through the glass. He could almost hear the faint rattle of their chains as the image took shape. It was not just a photograph. It was a graveyard of souls demanding justice from beyond the frame. But in 1888, West Virginia, justice for the powerless was a fragile illusion. Photography itself was still treated with suspicion in the mountain communities, a strange, unnatural magic that many feared could steal souls, and the law, such as it was, bowed easily to wealth, land, and whiteness. Against the word of an established landowner like Ezekiel Greylock, the testimony of a traveling photographer would mean nothing. Piton found himself paralyzed between conscience and fear. For 3 weeks after his return to Charleston, he could not bring himself to act. The photograph sat locked inside his studio safe, its presence a constant weight pressing on his mind. He paced at night, haunted by the sight of those faces, by the knowledge that he alone held proof of an unspeakable evil. Yet the world around him offered no path forward. In that era, child labor was not a crime. It was survival. Bound-out children, informal apprenticeships, and orphaned laborers were accepted facts of life. The boundary between harsh discipline and outright abuse was blurred, defined more by local custom than by law. In the eyes of the state, the Greylocks might not even have been criminals. Henry Peton's dilemma was not only moral, it was existential. To speak meant ruin, to stay silent meant complicity. And as winter deepened across the mountains, the man who had captured the most damning photograph in Appalachian history stood alone, trapped between the weight of truth and the terror of what that truth might bring. More troubling still, Henry Peton began to realize that the Greylock family's power stretched far beyond the confines of their snow-buried hollow. What he had taken for local dominance was, in truth, the visible edge of something far older and far more insidious. When he finally gathered the courage to take his evidence to Charleston, the capital's marble corridors offered him little refuge. The reception was tepid, evasive, chilled by the kind of fear that only comes when truth threatens to expose the foundations of power itself. Sheriff James Rutledge heard Peton's testimony with a mask of polite skepticism. His pencil never moved, his eyes narrowing with each passing detail. He spoke of practical difficulties, of limited jurisdiction, of how hard it was to bring justice into mountain hollows where the law was more rumor than rule. But beneath the bureaucratic language, Peton sensed something darker, a recognition. When pressed, the sheriff finally confessed, almost reluctantly, that Ezekiel Greylock was known to the authorities, known and trusted. The man who ruled Bone Creek Hollow had long served as an informant and cooperator, offering law enforcement his eyes and ears in the wilderness. That admission shifted everything. It suggested that the evil Peton had stumbled upon was not a hidden infection. It was an accepted arrangement. Over the following months, the photographer pursued a quiet, meticulous investigation, sifting through court ledgers and dusty parish archives. What he uncovered was monstrous. For 15 years, Ezekiel Greylock had appeared before local judges dozens of times, each instance wrapped in the language of legality and charity, formal adoptions, apprenticeships, placements for orphaned or impoverished children. Every signature, every seal was immaculate. But when Peton traced the names of those children, the trail ended in silence. The body simply vanished, swallowed whole by the paperless dark that hid behind official records. Then came the second revelation, colder still. Several of the very men charged with upholding the law, 2 judges, a county clerk, and more than one sheriff, had received loans from Ezekiel Greylock during their moments of financial distress. Those debts had long since blurred into dependence, transforming public servants into quiet accomplices. It was a web spun from money and silence, its threads binding church, courthouse, and constable alike. The mountain patriarch had created a self-sustaining system of corruption. He disposed of society's unwanted children, and in return, the system ensured he was never questioned. Even the churches, those supposed sanctuaries of moral conscience, had been drawn into the Greylock orbit. Their ministers praised Ezekiel's piety from the pulpit, grateful for his generous donations and his willingness to take in the unfortunate. Some even arranged placements themselves, believing, perhaps wanting to believe, that they were performing acts of Christian mercy. To the faithful, the Greylocks were models of godly virtue, industrious, charitable, blessed. But as Peton dug deeper, he uncovered whispers that the horror had roots reaching back decades. Elderly locals, when approached gently, would sometimes admit that their own kin had once sent children to the Greylocks for work in hard times. They would speak softly, eyes darting toward the door, before assuring him that those children did well, that they moved on to fine opportunities elsewhere. Each tale followed the same pattern: gratitude, denial, silence. By the time Peton laid his notes out across his desk, he understood the full scope of what he had found. Bone Creek Hollow was not an aberration. It was an institution, a machine of exploitation lubricated by faith, law, and fear. And every time he looked at the photograph of those 17 shackled children, their eyes seemed to demand a question that the civilized world had no answer for. How deep does this darkness go? He began to realize that what he was facing was far more sinister than a single family's crimes. It was an entire social mechanism built to erase what decent society could not bear to acknowledge. The children in his photograph were not simply victims. They were casualties of a system designed to make suffering invisible, existing in the blind spot of civilization where morality, law, and compassion ceased to function. As Peton dug deeper into the roots of the Greylock legacy, a darker lineage emerged from the fog of history. The horrors of Bone Creek Hollow were not new, they were inherited. The methods, the rituals of control, the machinery of disappearance had been refined across generations. It began with Jeremiah Greylock, the original patriarch who carved the family's dominion out of the wilderness in the early 19th century. Historical records showed that Jeremiah arrived in West Virginia with a strangely large number of apprentices and bound servants, children whose names appeared briefly in census ledgers before vanishing altogether. Those old records from the 1840s and 1850s revealed a disturbing pattern, fluctuating child populations in the Greylock household, as if the family's human inventory was in constant motion. Some names appeared for a single census, only to vanish by the next. Others reappeared years later, listed under entirely different surnames. The evidence pointed to a process, systematic, deliberate, perfected over time. Even more chilling were the fragments of oral histories and private letters that hinted at what became of the unfit or rebellious children. Neighboring families spoke in hushed tones of boys and girls who had supposedly run off after only a short stay with the Greylocks. Yet every disappearance followed the same suspicious rhythm during the bitter heart of winter, when the mountain passes were impassable, when snow sealed the world shut. The children never took their meager belongings, never sent word, never reappeared in any town or parish record. The land itself seemed to aid the concealment. Bone Creek Hollow was a labyrinth of shadow, its ridges pocked with ancient caves, its woods concealing forgotten mine shafts and bottomless ravines where daylight could never reach. Local trappers spoke of finding fragments of bone in thawing mud or scraps of faded fabric caught on roots near old quarry pits. Such discoveries were brushed aside, dismissed as the remnants of lost travelers or animal kills. No one wanted to ask what else the earth might be hiding. By the autumn of 1888, Peyton had pieced together a narrative so monstrous it defied belief, a 50-year continuum of child exploitation woven into the fabric of local society. The photograph that had sparked his horror was only the latest proof in a chain of atrocities spanning generations, shielded by silence, reinforced by corruption, and accepted by a community that preferred ignorance to confrontation. But proof alone was useless without allies. The photographer now faced the impossible task of convincing an establishment that had thrived on denial to confront its own complicity. For months he struggled, until salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. In December 1888, word of his inquiries reached the ears of someone who had once escaped Bone Creek Hollow's grasp. A woman living in Cincinnati under the assumed name of Sarah Miller contacted Peyton through a mutual acquaintance. Her real name was Sarah Kellerman. Born in 1851, she had been the youngest daughter of the Kellerman family, neighbors to the Greylocks in the earliest days of settlement. When her parents succumbed to typhoid fever in 1863, 12-year-old Sarah and her two younger brothers were placed under Ezekiel Greylock's guardianship, a Tau transaction formalized in local court records and sanctified by the church. What had seemed, on paper, like an act of Christian charity, would soon prove to be something far darker. What she endured during those 6 long years in Bone Creek Hollow carved itself into every waking moment of her existence after her escape in 1869. When Henry Peyton finally sat across from Sarah Kellerman in December of 1888, he was not merely speaking to a survivor. He was meeting the key that would unlock the full, horrific architecture of the Greylock Empire. Her testimony did not just confirm what his photograph had captured, it expanded it into something far more monstrous. The shackled children he had seen were only one fragment of a vast methodical machine, a system that fused forced labor, starvation, psychological domination, and a breeding program so calculated it bordered on the industrialization of human suffering. According to Sarah, what the Greylocks had built was not chaos. It was design. Over decades, they had refined their methods through relentless experimentation, learning precisely how to break the will of their captives without ever needing open violence. The iron restraints, she explained, were for the defiant, the ones who ran, who spoke too loudly, who still remembered what it meant to resist. But most were subdued through subtler tools. Chronic malnutrition kept them too weak to climb the mountain passes. Manipulation and isolation convinced them they were worthless, unwanted, and safer under Greylock control. Every scrap of food, every hour of sleep, every rare moment of kindness was weaponized. Rewards and punishments calibrated to ensure the children turned against one another rather than their captors. Even the architecture of Bone Creek Hollow reflected this grim intelligence. The dormitories Peyton had once mistaken for rustic farm buildings were, in reality, prisons, sealed structures of timber and stone, their doors bolted from the outside, their air thick with the scent of confinements. Inside, siblings were torn apart, friendships deliberately severed, every bond that might inspire unity systematically destroyed. Hunger ruled as the principal instrument of obedience. Rations were precisely measured to sustain labor but suppress rebellion. Enough to move, not enough to flee. Sarah spoke of nights filled with whispered fights over crumbs, of children turning on one another in the desperation of starvation until cooperation itself became a forgotten concept. But what froze Piton's blood more than any single act of cruelty was the revelation of the Greylock's long game, their attempt to create a self-replicating population of enslaved souls. The family's cruelty extended beyond the body into the realm of bloodlines. Sarah revealed that adolescent girls among the bound children were routinely forced into sexual pairings with older boys or chosen men, not for affection, but for breeding. The resulting infants were taken as property from birth, recorded as dependents of the household, and raised in total isolation. These second-generation captives, born, branded, and broken within Bone Creek Hollow, were the purest product of the Greylock system. They had no memory of freedom, no language for rebellion, no concept of life beyond the fences that enclosed their world. Many were deliberately denied education, kept illiterate and ignorant, ensuring their minds would never grasp the possibility of another existence. Sarah's voice, trembling but unbroken, gave form to a truth so dark that even Piton, a man hardened by years of witnessing human struggle, found himself trembling. What she described was not a crime of passion or circumstance. It was the deliberate engineering of human subjugation, perfected across generations, hidden behind piety and sanctified by silence. Comprehend, let alone prosecute. The deeper Henry Piton dug, the more he realized he was staring into a darkness far older and more entrenched than a single family's wickedness. He was confronting a system, a generational machinery of cruelty that had thrived beneath the nation's nose, hidden by geography, poverty, and silence. Sarah's testimony tore through the illusion of mountain innocence like a blade through cloth. The children in his photograph were not outliers. They were products of a method perfected through decades of cold experimentation. The Greylocks had learned how to manufacture obedience as other men learned to forge steel. Those who could be molded were reshaped through starvation, isolation, and fear. Those who could not, those whose spirits refused to bend, were made examples of. Sarah's memories of these lessons burned with the clarity of nightmares she could never wake from. She spoke of nights when the hollow itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the sound of splintering wood, the rush of cold water, or the echo of a child's final scream. The executions were not done in secret. They were performances. Ezekiel Greylock would force the surviving children to watch as defiance was crushed before their eyes. Some were drowned beneath the frozen surface of Bone Creek, their small bodies trapped beneath the ice like ghostly warnings until the thaw carried them away. Others were beaten, strangled, or simply vanished into the deep caverns that riddled the mountains, the land itself becoming an accomplice to murder. What Sarah revealed went beyond horror. It exposed a system designed not only to exploit flesh, but to erase will, to destroy the very concept of freedom in a child's mind. Those born inside the hollow, second and third generations of captives, were raised in total ignorance of the outside world. They spoke only the language of their captors, believed the mountains were the edge of existence, and viewed Ezekiel's rule as divine law. Escape to them was not impossible. It was inconceivable. Sarah's own escape had been an act of near-miraculous defiance. At 18, she still remembered the scent of spring fields, the sound of hymnals in her parents' cabin, fragments of a normal world that gave her courage. Over months, she hoarded crumbs of bread, memorized the mountain trails, and waited for a winter storm fierce enough to hide her flight. The night she fled, she walked barefoot through snow so deep it numbed her legs to the knees, guided only by moonlight and desperation. She never saw her brothers again. But survival came with a cost: memory. Sarah carried the hollow with her for the rest of her life, and her words gave Piton a map of evil far more intricate than he could have imagined. The Greylocks were not merely mountain tyrants, they were entrepreneurs of human misery. Their wealth came not only from stolen labor, but from commerce in flesh, selling children deemed fit to other shadowy operations across the Appalachians. Each transaction was masked by paperwork, by adoptions signed in courthouse offices where judges owed Ezekiel Greylock more than they owed the law. Worse still, Sarah's recollections hinted at something larger. A network of similar enclaves scattered through the mountain ranges, each one a mirror of Bone Creek Hollow. Other surnames, other patriarchs, same patterns. The implication chilled Piton to his core. This was not an anomaly, but a systemic industry of human exploitation thriving beneath the veneer of 19th century respectability. As the snows deepened that winter of 1888, Henry Piton sat in his Charleston studio surrounded by his notes, the testimony, and the photograph that had begun it all. 17 children staring out from the paper like silent witnesses to half a century of organized horror. He now understood that the image in his possession was not merely evidence of one family's depravity, but the first visible crack in an empire of suffering America had chosen not to see. The horror that shrouded Bone Creek Hollow did not end with Sarah's escape, it merely learned to write letters. By the winter of 1888, Piton realized that what he held in his hands was not just evidence. It was a map of a rot so deep, the law itself had become part of the disease. Too many officials were bought, too many decades had passed, and too many powerful hands fed from the silence that had kept this nightmare buried. With Sarah Kellerman's harrowing testimony, Piton spent the early months of 1889 waging a desperate war against the invisible machinery protecting the Greylock name. He hunted for witnesses, clawed for proof, and tried to stitch together a case strong enough to survive a system built to destroy it. Then, one cold February morning, the past found Sarah. A letter arrived at her Cincinnati home, ink faded, but the message sharp as a knife. In an unsteady, cunning hand, it read, "We know where you are, Sarah Kellerman. We know about your husband, Charles Miller, and your daughter, Emma. Mountain justice has a long memory, and family debts are never forgotten. Some secrets should stay buried in the hollow where they belong." Beneath the words, a crude drawing of a Greylock flower, the mountain laurel from which the family took its name, stared back like a curse reborn. That letter shattered any illusion of safety. It meant the Greylocks were watching, alive, organized, and vengeful. Their reach stretched far beyond Bone Creek. Piton feared the unthinkable, that other survivors had been found, dragged back, or silenced forever through threats against the families they built after freedom. Acting swiftly, he moved Sarah and her loved ones to a secure location, then began tracing how the Greylocks had pierced her new identity. The answer was buried in the dry ink of government recos. Yes, Piton's search through Ohio marriage and birth archives revealed a chilling pattern. Clerks had received quiet inquiries about a woman named Sarah Kellerman, also known as Sarah Miller. The supposed family members requesting reunion had offered small payments for information. Those few coins had bought them everything: her married name, her address, her new life. Piton's heart sank. The enemy wasn't just in the mountains, it was in the paper, the ink, the offices of men who didn't even know they'd sold a woman's soul. He began to suspect his investigation had already been breached. If the Greylocks could trace victims across states, what stopped them from watching the man exposing them? His suspicions turned to dread when he returned to his Charleston studio that March. The lock was untouched, but the air inside was wrong. Papers had shifted, files had been opened, his safe, pried, examined, resealed, nothing stolen, everything seen. On his desk, a single Greylock flower lay waiting, its white petals curling brown in the warm air. A warning, a promise, a signature from the mountain itself. And so, just when the nightmare seemed to be fading into history, Bone Creek Hollow whispered again, reminding the living that some horrors do not die. They wait. They remember. They write back. The photograph that had once seemed like a haunting curiosity had become a key to understanding a horror that spread far beyond one valley. But before we reach that point, if you're someone who thrives on unraveling the darkest mysteries buried in history, make sure you've subscribed, liked, and shared this story. Because what follows is not just disturbing, it's almost unimaginable. As the threats escalated, so did the strange activity deep within the Appalachian wilderness. Travelers passing near Bone Creek Hollow began to whisper of unsettling sights, lines of torchlight moving silently through the trees, the echo of hammering in the dead of night, the sharp metallic clatter of tools on stone. The Greylocks, it seemed, were preparing for something. Local merchants noticed their orders had changed. Gone were the usual farm provisions. In their place, crates of ammunition, barrels of salted meat, sacks of dried beans, jars of medicine, and stacks of lumber thick enough to build fortifications. It was as if the mountain family was readying itself for siege, an invisible war no one else could see coming. Then came the retribution. One by one, those who had dared speak to Piton began to suffer. A county clerk, who had confessed to accepting Greylock money, awoke to find his barn engulfed in flames. The merchant who had told Piton about the family's strange purchases returned to his store one morning to discover it burglarized, but not looted. The thieves had taken nothing of value except his ledgers and personal letters, and the minister who had dared question the morality of child placements with the Mountain clan. He began receiving visits from strangers, men who smiled too widely, who claimed to be conducting religious surveys, yet lingered too long and asked too much about his wife and children. The message was unmistakable. The Greylocks were everywhere, and their reach was longer than anyone imagined. They weren't just a family, they were a shadow institution. Their wealth had purchased silence, their violence enforced it, and their connections made them untouchable. Piton's investigation had peeled back a layer of rot that extended far beyond Bone Creek Hollow. These were people who could bribe clerks, intimidate clergy, burn barns, and make entire families vanish, all while smiling politely in church pews on Sunday mornings. But the most chilling revelation came not from the mountains, but from the marble corridors of authority itself. When Piton sought help from federal law enforcement, he expected outrage, intervention, justice. Instead, he met with suspicion. Marshals questioned why a simple photographer from Charleston was prying into sensitive regional matters. They hinted that the Greylocks had been cooperating with federal agents for years, feeding them intelligence on moonshiners, smugglers, and outlaws hidden in the Appalachians. Disrupting that relationship, they warned, could jeopardize ongoing operations. In that moment, the full horror became clear. The Greylocks' crimes were not hidden from the government, they were protected by it. Federal agents were turning a blind eye, not out of ignorance, but convenience. The suffering of children had become collateral damage in the name of law and order. By the spring of 1889, Piton understood the depth of the nightmare he had uncovered. The photographs he once thought depicted a single atrocity were now revealed to be evidence of something vast, coordinated, and sanctioned by silence. What began as a search for truth had drawn him into the black heart of a system built on corruption, cruelty, and complicity, a machine that consumed innocence to maintain power, and somewhere deep in those mountains, beneath the twisted pines and the weight of centuries of fear, the Greylocks were still watching. By the spring of 1889, the photograph that had once sparked William Piton's curiosity had transformed into something far darker, no longer a mere image of human suffering, but a damning testament to the failure of the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. It was proof that America's mechanisms of justice, charity, and faith had all conspired, whether through cowardice or complicity, to allow a nightmare to take root and thrive beneath their watch. But the true horror was only beginning to reveal itself. In April of that year, news reached Piton that 3 more children had vanished from scattered mountain homesteads, each disappearance bearing the unmistakable signature of Greylock involvement. The message was chillingly clear. The family was not retreating under scrutiny. They were expanding. What had begun as an attempt to expose historical crimes had now become a desperate race to prevent new atrocities. The Hollow's hunger was growing, and every day that passed without intervention meant another child swallowed by those blackened woods. Piton's case was unraveling beneath the weight of fear and silence. His witnesses had vanished behind bolted doors, their courage devoured by whispered threats. His own safety was compromised, his every movement shadowed by unseen eyes. The machinery of law that should have brought justice seemed rusted through with corruption. Time was running out, and still the mountains echoed with the cries of children no one dared to save, screams that rose, collided against stone, and died in the eternal hush of Bone Creek Hollow, where obedience was forged by starvation and silence was sealed in iron. Then, out of that abyss, came the single spark that would shatter everything. The reckoning began not with a raid or a courtroom revelation, but with a single boy's desperate flight for freedom. On the night of May 15th, 1889, a 14-year child, old named Michael Brennan, fled Bone Creek Hollow under the cover of darkness. He crossed 27 miles of rugged, merciless mountain terrain before collapsing at dawn on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. What made his escape miraculous was not only the distance traveled or the perils faced, but the fact that Michael had been born in captivity, one of the second-generation children bred within the Greylock system. He had never before seen the outside world. His arrival struck the town like a lightning bolt through dry timber. For decades, Bone Creek had been an open secret, a wound covered but never cleansed. But Michael Brennan changed that. He was not a runaway who could be dismissed as a troubled youth. He carried the truth on his skin, in his eyes, and in the trembling pages of what he brought with him. From beneath his tattered clothes, investigators uncovered a bundle of documents, maps meticulously drawn from memory detailing every structure in the Greylock compound, lists of names and ages of the imprisoned children, and most damning of all, small trinkets, locks of hair, hand-sewn dolls, wooden carvings, and faded ribbons. Each item corresponded to a missing child reported across multiple counties. Proof, undeniable and uncorrupted, that Bone Creek Hollow was not legend. It was an operating graveyard of innocence. When Michael stumbled into the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's office just before sunrise, the men inside froze at the sight of him. His emaciated frame bore the imprint of prolonged suffering. Bones that had once been broken and left to heal crooked, burn scars in the shape of brands, and the hollowed cheeks of long starvation. Yet it was not his wounds that spoke the loudest. It was his words. In a voice stripped of childhood, Michael described the horrors of Bone Creek Hollow with surgical precision. He detailed the Greylock's punishments, their disciplinary rituals, their methods of psychological control. He spoke of the breeding barns, the chained dormitories, and the pits where the uncooperative disappeared. Every word dripped with the weight of unbearable truth. Sheriff Rutledge, who had long dismissed Piton's accusations as mountain gossip, felt the last of his skepticism collapse under the boy's testimony. When several of Michael's maps and names were verified against existing records, denial was no longer possible. The nightmare Piton had been chasing for years had finally stepped, bleeding and breathing, into the light of day. The boy's testimony struck like a thunderclap across every institution that had once turned a blind eye. His descriptions of the missing aligned with official records down to the smallest, most haunting detail: birthmarks, hair color, the dates they vanished, all impossibly precise unless he had truly lived among them. His hand-drawn maps of Bone Creek Hollow matched century-old survey charts with an accuracy that stunned investigators, while his recollections of the family's operations exposed the inner machinery of a criminal empire masquerading as a rural clan. Yet the most chilling revelation lay in how this 14-year-old had come to possess such forbidden knowledge. Born within the Hollow, Michael had been one of the Hollow-born, the children bred for servitude, neither kidnapped nor freed but manufactured into captivity. Because he could read and write, he was granted minor responsibilities, serving as a record keeper, a silent archivist of horror. Over the course of years, under constant surveillance and threat of death, he committed to memory the Greylock family's hidden bookkeeping, who had died, who had been sold, who had simply vanished beneath the earth. Every name, every number, every cruel experiment, preserved through his secret notes, etched into his mind with the precision of survival. What his testimony revealed was staggering. The infamous photograph Henry Peaton had captured in 1887, the one that had launched the entire investigation, was not a glimpse of a single atrocity. It was merely a fragment of a vast and methodical system. By the time Michael fled in 1889, there were 47 living captives in the hollow, children and young adults ranging from newly taken 6-year-olds to women of 20 who had known no life beyond bondage, now forced to bear the next generation of slaves. But what drove Michael to risk everything was what he overheard one night in the depths of that cursed valley: Ezekiel Greylock's plan to erase it all. The family had decided to clean house, to slaughter every remaining captive and burn the hollow to ash before moving westward into territories where no law could follow. They had done it before, smaller purges, masked as epidemics, plagues that conveniently wiped away witnesses, but this time the scale was monstrous. 47 souls marked for death, their annihilation to be explained away as a fevered tragedy. Michael, realizing what was coming, chose defiance over doom. He gathered his stolen records, memorized escape routes, and fled into the mountains under cover of darkness. His every step a rebellion against generations of silence. With his testimony and tangible proof now in hand, Sheriff James Rutledge could no longer claim ignorance. For the first time, the forces of law prepared to strike back. Yet even then, secrecy was vital. Too many deputies, too many officials were still on the Greylock payroll. If word of the raid leaked, every captive in the hollow would die before the rescuers arrived. Thus, the strike force that gathered was unlike any conventional posse. Federal marshals brought in from distant districts, volunteer civilians unconnected to local power, and a handful of lawmen whose integrity had survived the rot of corruption. On the morning of June the 3rd, 1889, they rode into Bone Creek Hollow, and what they uncovered defied comprehension. The valley was no simple farmstead, but an engineered complex devoted to the industrial exploitation of human life. Beneath its pastoral facade, the investigators found the remains of hundreds, bones, tools, ledgers, the discarded remnants of more than 5 decades of systematic enslavement. The evidence was irrefutable, a mountain of truth too vast to deny. And yet, as they stood amid the ruins of the Greylock Empire, one question lingered in every man's mind: how many other hollows still whispered the same unspeakable secret across the dark heart of Appalachia? Mass graves were uncovered, silent fields of horror, filled with the small, fragile remains of children who had succumbed to starvation, disease, abuse, or deliberate execution. The Greylock family had chronicled their atrocities with the cold precision of accountants, maintaining ledgers that recorded every acquisition, every punishment, every disposal of a life, as though they were managing livestock rather than human beings. Inside the decaying structures of the compound, investigators found instruments of restraint and torture, devices engineered not in haste or chaos, but with deliberate, perverse craftsmanship. Their design spoke of a cruelty that was not impulsive, but methodical, refined through generations of practice. Hardened lawmen, men who had witnessed war, murder, and every manner of human depravity, were left pale and trembling by what they saw. Yet the most chilling revelation was that Bone Creek Hollow was not an isolated horror. It was merely one node in a sprawling web. Among the seized records were letters, manifests, and coded correspondences linking the Greylocks to kindred operations across 7 states, forming what appeared to be a coordinated network of child trafficking that had thrived in the shadows of Appalachia for decades. The letters spoke in bureaucratic tones of exchanges, children transferred between partners, the sharing of disciplinary techniques, and organized strategies for infiltrating law enforcement, silencing witness, and securing protection through bribery and blackmail. When the raid commenced, the confrontation that followed defied every expectation. The Greylock family did not flee, resist, or deny. They were waiting, calm, prepared. Ezekiel Greylock himself, his hair silvered with age, his eyes still sharp with predatory intelligence, stood at the head of his household as though hosting a grim reception. He welcomed Sheriff Rutledge and his marshals with unnerving civility, immediately launching into rehearsed explanations. Every horror they would find, he claimed, was sanctioned, part of a covert federal initiative that required unconventional containment methods. He presented forged letters stamped with counterfeit seals, naming high-ranking officials and hinting at secret government contracts. The lie was elegant, dangerous, and almost convincing. It would have succeeded, if not for Michael Brennan, the boy, thin and ghost-like, now serving as both witness and guide, led investigators through the labyrinth of Ezekiel's deceit. He pointed out falsified records, hidden caches, and underground rooms designed to conceal the worst of the family's crimes. His words stripped away the illusion, exposing the truth. The Greylocks had no intention of surrendering. Their apparent cooperation was a calculated maneuver meant to delay the lawmen long enough to erase the evidence. As search teams spread through the hollow, they discovered barrels of lamp oil placed throughout key structures, wired for ignition. An inferno waiting only for a spark. Then came the most sickening discovery of all. Many of the surviving captives, frail children barely clinging to life, had been poisoned during their morning meal. It was a final act of destruction, carried out under the guise of surrender. The family had sought to silence the witnesses, even as they smiled and spoke of negotiation. Only swift action by the raiding party saved most of the victims from death, though several would bear lasting scars of the attempt. This was the Greylock family's final revelation, that their evil was not the product of desperation or madness, but of principle, an efficient, deliberate system that valued secrecy above human life. Their calm, their planning, their precision, all of it spoke to a horror beyond emotion. The trials that followed the Bone Creek Hollow raid would become among the most significant in West Virginia's history. Yet the fight for justice, as investigators soon learned, was no less labyrinthine, no less tainted than the crimes that had birthed it. For in unearthing the Greylock's empire, they had also unearthed the rot that had allowed it to flourish. The Greylock revelations struck at the very foundation of American institutions, exposing not merely a single family's depravity, but the rot of systemic complicity that had allowed such horror to endure. The truth was undeniable. Every level of government and society had failed. Ezekiel Greylock and his immediate kin were ultimately convicted on charges that spanned kidnapping, murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Yet the courtroom confessions and the documents unearthed during their trials revealed a darkness that stretched far beyond Bone Creek Hollow. 12 county officials, 6 judges, and a number of law enforcement officers were exposed as enablers, men who had taken bribes, silenced witnesses, and turned their eyes away from the cries echoing through those cursed mountains. For over 3 years, a tidal wave of investigations dismantled the entire power structure across 4 counties, ripping out the political machinery that had protected the Greylocks for half a century. But even as justice clawed its way through layers of corruption, a different tragedy unfolded. One that the courts were powerless to resolve. The children rescued from the hollow were shadows of human beings, many without names, birth records, or any conception of a world beyond their captivity. Some had been inborn in chains, their entire existence confined to that valley of torment. Reuniting them with their families proved nearly impossible. They had been stolen too young, their memories erased by trauma and time, while their loved ones had long buried them in grief. What awaited was not homecoming, but disorientation, a world too bright, too strange, too free for minds raised in darkness. Psychologists and physicians, unprepared for the magnitude of such systematic abuse, struggled to comprehend the scars these children bore. They did not fit the medical language of the day. Many were unable to adapt to normal life. They recoiled from touch, from laughter, from light. Some required permanent institutional care. Others vanished back into the mountains, ghosts returning to the only world that had ever made sense to them. And yet, amid the ruins of despair, one figure emerged as both a symbol of hope and an echo of sorrow. Michael Brennan, The boy who had fled Bone Creek Hollow, who had defied a legacy of terror and shattered the silence, became an emblem of courage. In the years that followed, he rebuilt his life in Pennsylvania, becoming a teacher and an advocate for child welfare reform. But though he fought to save others, he could never fully save himself. Haunted by guilt and the memory of those he could not rescue, Michael carried his pain like a second shadow, a reminder of the hundreds who had never escaped. At the center of it all remained one haunting image, the photograph Henry Peton had taken in 1887. That frozen moment in time, capturing 17 shackled children standing barefoot in the snow, became evidence not only in court, but in conscience. It forced a nation to confront its own blindness, that such horror had festered in its heartlands, beneath crosses, courthouses, and polite conversation. The image changed law, policy, and perception. The Bone Creek Hollow case sent tremors far beyond West Virginia. It revealed a hidden geography of evil, networks of exploitation operating under the same veil of isolation, corruption, and denial. In response, federal laws were passed mandating stricter oversight of child placement and harsher penalties for those who ignored reports of abuse. But in the vast forgotten stretches of rural America, enforcement remained fragile and silence still reigned. Most chilling of all were the unanswered questions. Records showed that dozens of children had been sold or transferred to other enterprises before the raid, their destinations marked only by cryptic notes and initials in the Greylock ledgers. Many were never found. Investigators traced leads into the Western Territories, but the trail dissolved into wilderness and rumor. What became of those children remains one of history's unhealed wounds. The full measure of the Greylock family's crimes and the human suffering they unleashed may never be known. The land where Bone Creek Hollow once stood has long since been surrendered to time. Ivy and wild grass now creep over the rotting timbers, and the wind whispers through the ruins where human screams once echoed. Nature has done what justice could not, bury the evidence beneath layers of soil and silence. The nearby communities, scorched by the revelation of the horrors that had taken root so close to their homes, turned away in collective denial. They sealed their shame behind closed doors and unspoken memories. The hollow fell quiet once more, but this time it was the suffocating quiet of guilt rather than complicity. Among those who survived, few carried the burden as heavily as Sarah Kellerman. Her testimony had been the backbone of the prosecution, yet every word she spoke on the stand reopened wounds that had never healed. Haunted by the memories she had been forced to relive, she devoted the rest of her life to the search for lost children, an act of penance and purpose intertwined. Her tireless crusade, fueled by guilt and Mark's determination, helped establish the first national databases for missing persons in American law enforcement. It was her way of ensuring that no other child would vanish into the dark corners of neglect and be forgotten. The Greylock case tore open a wound in the nation's conscience. It forced America to face a truth it had long buried, that cruelty does not always wear the mask of madness, nor hide in the shadows of superstition. Sometimes it thrives in plain sight, nourished by isolation, sustained by corruption, and ignored by those too afraid to question authority. It revealed a society willing to trade moral clarity for comfort and justice for silence. Today, Henry Peton's photograph, the image that sparked the investigation and changed history, hangs inside the West Virginia State Archives. 17 faces, frozen in silver halide, stare back through the glass with eyes that refuse to fade. Their hollow gazes demand remembrance. They are witnesses, eternal and unflinching, to the cruelty humanity is capable of, and the courage that can rise to confront it. The story of Bone Creek Hollow endures not merely as one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but as a testament to resistance, the proof that even in the deepest abyss, truth can still find light. Those children waited more than half a century for justice, and though the cost was unbearable, their suffering was not in vain. A photographer who refused to look away, a boy who risked everything to speak, a handful of people who defied fear to bring truth to light. In the end, this tragedy reminds us that the most chilling monsters are not born of myth or nightmare, but of ordinary people who surrender their humanity one choice at a time. What do you think? Could such a vast web of cruelty truly hide for decades in the heart of a community? Share your thoughts below, and if stories like this grip you, subscribe, hit the notification bell and join us again, because in the world of forgotten horrors, silence is never the end.